The dress wasn't perfect. Molly knew that better than anyone. She had spent 3 nights sewing it by candlelight, using gray wool thread that Dora, the washerwoman, had given her as a gift. It wasn't silk. It wasn't velvet. It was linen dyed with walnut bark, a shade somewhere between copper and honey, that grew too warm near the fire and faded in the rain. But she had hand-stitched the hems herself, had fitted the belt with a buckle she found in the lost-and-found storage room, had braided her own hair with care that afternoon, tucking the golden strands with a leather cord that Bryn, her only real friend in that enormous castle, had twisted for her while humming softly. "You look like a lady," Bryn had said, her eyes glistening with the conviction of someone who truly believed it. Molly hadn't answered. She had only looked at her reflection in the water basin they used as a mirror and thought, maybe, for one night, it will be enough. The great hall of Vorn Fortress burned with the light of dozens of torches mounted on wrought iron brackets. Smoke rose in golden threads toward the dark oak beams overhead, carrying the scent of burning resin, melted wax, spiced wine, and roasting meat from the kitchens 2 floors below. The banners of every pack in the region hung from the stone walls, the black raven of House Ashvale, the silver stag of the Durin, the 3-headed wolf of the Vorn, who owned the fortress and every acre of territory surrounding it. Long tables filled the hall in parallel rows, draped with rough linen and loaded with bronze platters, jugs of red wine, and candles in iron holders. It was harvest night. Once a year, the packs of the region gathered at the fortress to renew alliances, present heirs, negotiate borders, and, more important than anything else, at least for those without title or land, for unmated wolves to choose one another before the eyes of the entire pack. Molly was not nobility. She was a maid. She had arrived at the fortress at 17, sent by the council of the village of Myr as part of a service agreement, and in the 4 years since she had learned to be invisible. To sweep corridors before dawn, to change bed linens without a sound, to pour wine without spilling a drop, and without raising her eyes to the faces of those who drank. But Caden Vorn had noticed her. Caden was the second son of Alpha Vorn, a man of 30 with broad shoulders, brown hair, and an easy smile that concealed things Molly had taken far too long to see clearly. For nearly 2 years, he had sought her out in hallways, had stopped to talk, had touched her arm with a familiarity that made her color rise. 3 weeks before harvest night, he had promised that he would choose her before the pack, that he would pull her out of servitude, that he would move her to a different wing of the castle entirely. "I know you have no clan," he had said, leaning against the wall of the kitchen corridor, watching her with that smile. But that doesn't matter to me. She had believed him, not because she was naive. She was, in truth, the least naive creature in that castle. She had learned early enough that words cost nothing, and that promises carry no weight until someone actually bears them. But something about Caden had seemed real. Or perhaps she had simply wanted it to be. Now, standing in the great hall, she was positioned along the side wall where servants usually stood to refill jugs and collect empty platters. Bryn was at her shoulder, holding a wine jug, her eyes fixed on the high table with a tight expression. "He still hasn't looked this way," Bryn murmured, low enough that only Molly could hear. "He will," Molly said, and she almost managed to sound certain. The high table sat on a raised stone platform at the far end of the hall, reserved for the highest-ranking wolves at the gathering. Alpha Vorn sat at the center, a heavy-set man with a gray-streaked beard and small, calculating eyes. Beside him sat his wife, draped in green velvet, her expression permanently arranged into polite indifference. Caden sat 2 seats to the right of his father, laughing at something the man beside him had said, a goblet loose in his hand. He looked comfortable, relaxed, completely unbothered by the fact that somewhere along the side wall stood a woman in a walnut-dyed linen dress who had spent 3 nights sewing it because he had made her a promise. Molly kept her posture straight. She had learned that too, over 4 years of service. How to hold the spine upright even when everything inside wanted to fold. How to keep the face still, how to breathe slowly enough that the chest doesn't betray what the throat is doing. The ritual of choosing began midway through the evening, after the second round of wine and the removal of the meat platters. It was not a formal ceremony. There were no words spoken by a priest or a council elder. In the pack tradition, choosing was done simply. A male wolf crossed the hall and stood before the woman he intended to claim, and if she accepted, they drank from the same cup before the eyes of all present. It was public. It was binding. And it was, in this world, the closest thing to a declaration that existed. Molly watched as two choices were made at other tables. A young beta from the Duran pack walked to a red-haired woman near the eastern wall. A broad-shouldered man from the Ashvale clan crossed the room with obvious nerves and stood before a woman who laughed and pulled him down to sit beside her. The hall responded to each pairing with a low murmur of approval, the kind of sound that filled the room like warmth. She waited. Bryn's hand found her elbow. A light touch. The kind that says I'm here without saying anything at all. Then Caden stood. Molly's heart moved once, sharp and specific, the way it does when something you have been holding on to suddenly becomes real. She watched him push back from the high table, smooth the front of his tunic, and step down from the raised platform. The hall quieted slightly. He was a Vorn son, after all, and a Vorn choosing carried weight. He walked. But not toward the side wall. He walked toward the eastern side of the hall, toward the table where the Ashvale guests were seated, and he stopped in front of a dark-haired woman in a deep burgundy gown, the eldest daughter of Beta Ashvale, Molly realized, with a cold clarity that arrived before the pain did. The hall murmured in approval. Molly did not move. She did not make a sound. She felt Bryn's grip tighten on her elbow, and she simply stood there, with her walnut-dyed dress, and her careful braid, and her leather cord tie. And she watched Caden Vorn choose an alliance over a promise. He didn't look toward the side wall once. The dark-haired woman accepted. The shared cup was passed. The hall rang with approval, and Alpha Vorn at the high table nodded slowly with the satisfied expression of a man who had arranged something precisely the way he intended. Molly set down the wine jug she was holding. She placed it carefully on the table beside her, making sure it didn't tip. Then she turned toward the side corridor that led back to the servants' quarters. She had nearly reached the archway when she heard it. Not a voice, but a shift in the hall's atmosphere. The particular quality of silence that falls when someone important enters a room. She stopped without meaning to. 3 men had come through the main doors at the far end of the hall. They were not from any of the local packs. Molly knew every face in Vorn Fortress by now, knew the guests, knew the retinues, knew the banners. These men belonged to none of them. They wore dark traveling cloaks still carrying the dust of a long road, and beneath the cloaks, armor. Black leather straps, iron buckles, the kind of equipment that spoke of real use rather than ceremony. The first was tall and sharp-faced, with a restless energy and a half-smile that suggested he found most situations faintly amusing. The second was broader, with a copper-red beard and the relaxed posture of a man who has never felt the need to prove anything to anyone in a room. The third said nothing, looked at nothing in particular, and yet the entire hall oriented toward him the way iron filings orient toward a lodestone. He was the tallest of the 3. Dark hair pulled back in tight braids, pale eyes that moved across the room with the measured patience of someone taking inventory rather than looking for entertainment. A scar ran along his jaw. Old, clean, the kind left by something precise. He wore no crown, no visible symbol of rank. And yet every wolf in that hall seemed to have registered his presence before he had taken 3 steps through the door. Alpha Vorn was already rising from his seat. Molly stood still in the archway. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know what he was. But something in the oldest, quietest part of her instincts recognized the weight of what had just walked into the room, and understood, without words, that the night was not over. It had not even truly begun. His name moved through the hall before he did. Molly caught it in pieces, whispered between 2 Ashvale men near the eastern table, repeated with poorly concealed tension by one of Alpha Vorn's advisors, spoken once, low and careful, by the gray-bearded steward who had served the fortress for 30 years and whose composure Molly had never once seen break. Aiden Kale, the Alpha King. She didn't know what she had expected a king to look like. She had grown up in Mere, a village of farmers and river traders, and the concept of royalty had existed for her the way storms exist for people who have never left a valley, as something large and distant and theoretical. In 4 years at Vorn Fortress, she had served nobles, betas, pack alphas, council elders. She had learned the hierarchy of this world the way you learn the layout of a building you live in. Not by studying it, but by navigating it daily without being crushed. But Aiden Kale was something else. He stood near the entrance of the hall while Alpha Vorn descended from the raised platform with more speed than dignity, crossing the room with his arms already spread in the practiced gesture of a man performing welcome. Aiden watched him come. He didn't move forward to close the distance. He didn't smile. He waited with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that the world will rearrange itself around him if he simply holds position. "My Lord King," Alpha Vorn said, loud enough for the hall to hear. "We were not informed of your arrival." "No," Aiden said. "You weren't." 2 words. The hall absorbed them like stone absorbs cold. The sharp-faced man to Aiden's right, the one with the restless energy and the half-smile, looked around the room with open curiosity, his pale eyes cataloging faces and corners with the cheerful efficiency of someone who enjoys gathering information. The broad one with the copper beard had already moved slightly to the left, positioning himself at an angle that Molly, who had spent years learning to read rooms, recognized as a guard stance dressed as casual posture. They were not here for harvest night. She understood that immediately. Men who travel hard roads and arrive without announcement at a pack gathering do not come for the wine and the choosing rituals. They come because something has already happened, or because something is about to. Alpha Vorn was steering the king toward the high table, talking in the practiced, flowing way of a man who uses words the way other men use walls, to redirect, to contain, to prevent things from moving where he doesn't want them to go. Aiden walked beside him without appearing to listen, which Molly suspected meant he was listening to everything. She should have left. She was a maid standing in a servant's archway at the edge of a hall full of pack nobility, still wearing a dress she had made herself out of dyed linen, still holding the faint bruise of a humiliation that no one else in that room would have noticed or cared about. She had no reason to stay. She had every reason to walk down the corridor, climb the back stairs, and return to the room she shared with Bryn and 2 other girls, where she could sit on the edge of her straw mattress and decide in private how she felt about what had happened tonight. She stayed. Bryn appeared at her shoulder, no longer carrying the wine jug, her expression caught somewhere between worry and fascination. "Do you know who that is?" she breathed. "Aiden Kale, the Alpha King, Molly, the king of all packs. He hasn't left the Northern Keep in 2 years, they say. He doesn't travel. He doesn't attend gatherings. He sends representatives." Bryn paused. "Something is very wrong." Molly said nothing. She was watching the hall rearrange itself around the king's presence the way she had predicted it would, pack alphas shifting in their seats, conversations dying and restarting in lower registers, eyes moving toward the high table, and then quickly away. The choosing ritual had effectively ceased. No one was walking across any floor toward anyone. The entire social machinery of Harvest Night had simply stopped, as if someone had lifted the weight off a gear. Only Caden Vorn seemed unaffected. He was still seated beside the dark-haired Ashvale woman, still talking, still relaxed. But there was something in the angle of his shoulders now, a tightness that hadn't been there before. And once, briefly, his eyes moved to his father and the king, and Molly saw something pass through his expression that she didn't have a name for yet. She filed it away. That was another thing 4 years of invisible service had taught her. How to file things away. How to keep a mental ledger of small observations that seemed meaningless in isolation, but occasionally, when set against each other, revealed a shape. The shape she was beginning to see tonight had edges she didn't like. It was past the second torch lighting, well into the late hours, When the wine had been refilled twice, and the hall had settled into the looser, louder rhythm of a gathering that had given up on formality, that Molly went back to work. She had no choice. The head housekeeper, a sharp-eyed woman named Sable, who had never once in 4 years spoken to Molly with warmth, found her near the archway and directed her to the high table with a look that required no words. The king was present. The king's men needed attending. The good wine was to be poured, not the house blend. Molly took the jug and went. She worked the high table the way she worked every table, efficiently, quietly, eyes down, movements measured. She refilled the goblet of the copper-bearded man, who thanked her with a nod and the easy manners of someone raised around servants, but not contemptuous of them. She moved to the sharp-faced man, who was in the middle of a low conversation with one of Vorn's council members, and didn't acknowledge her at all, which was standard. She reached the king. His goblet was still more than half full. She wouldn't need to pour. She could simply move on, continue down the table, return to the wall. That was the correct, invisible thing to do. She stopped beside him. Not because she meant to. Not because she had planned anything. She stopped because, at that exact moment, with the proximity that serving required, she caught something. A fragment of conversation, low and partially swallowed by the noise of the hall, between two men seated 2 positions down the table. She recognized one of the voices. Caden. And the words she caught, not all of them, just enough, were not the words of a man celebrating his choosing night. Position before dawn. The Eastern Passage. He won't know until... Molly kept moving. She completed the circuit of the table, returned to the wall, set down the jug. Her hands were steady. Her face was steady. Inside, the filing system she had built over 4 years was working very fast. She thought about what she knew. She knew the Eastern Passage. Every servant in Vorn Fortress knew it. A stone corridor cut into the outer wall during the fortress's original construction, used now for moving laundry and supply crates, wide enough for 2 people walking side by side, but rarely lit and almost never monitored. It connected the interior of the fortress to the outer courtyard, and from the outer courtyard, there were 3 routes out. The main gate, the river dock, and the old postern door that the guards had stopped watching 2 years ago because it was assumed to be sealed. It wasn't sealed. Molly knew that, because she had used it herself, in winter, to carry ash bins out when the main corridor was blocked by a delivery. She also knew that the Alpha King had arrived without announcement, that Alpha Vorn had received him with the careful warmth of a man concealing alarm, that Caden's shoulders had tightened when he looked at his father, that the king's men, despite the relaxed surface of their posture, had not touched much wine. And she knew one more thing, the thing that sat at the center of all the others like a stone in still water. Caden Vorn was Aiden Kale's appointed beta of the southern reaches. She had heard that in passing months ago from a conversation she wasn't supposed to be listening to. The position was political. It meant Caden was meant to be the king's representative in this territory, his trusted voice in the south. His beta. Position before dawn. The Eastern Passage. He won't know until... Molly stood very still for a long moment. Then she tore a strip from the inside hem of her linen dress, the part no one could see, the part she had stitched herself 3 nights ago by candlelight. And she asked Bryn, quietly, for the small piece of charcoal she always kept in her apron pocket for marking linens. Bryn handed it over without asking questions. That was what 4 years of friendship looked like. Molly wrote 4 words. Small and clear. The way she'd been taught by the village scribe who had taken pity on a 7-year-old girl who wanted to learn. She folded the strip of linen twice. Then she picked up the wine jug, walked back to the high table, and when she reached the king, whose goblet still didn't need refilling, she set the folded strip of linen on the table beside his hand with the quiet, unremarkable movement of a woman who has spent 4 years being invisible. And she walked away. She was back at the wall, eyes forward, face still, before she heard the silence. Not the silence of a hall. The silence of one man, in a hall full of noise, becoming completely motionless. She didn't look. She didn't need to. But she felt it, the specific, unmistakable weight of a gaze that had found her across a crowded room and decided, with no apparent effort, to stay. She did not sleep. Bryn had fallen asleep quickly, curled on her side with her knees drawn up, breathing the slow and even breath of someone with a clear conscience and no particular catastrophe pending. The two other girls who shared the room, Petra and Wynne, both younger than Molly, both unaware that anything unusual had happened that evening, were equally unconscious within minutes of the candle being snuffed. Molly lay on her back and stared at the ceiling. She had done something tonight that could not be undone. She understood that with complete clarity. In this world, in this hierarchy, a maid did not pass notes to kings. A woman without clan, without title, without any social standing whatsoever, did not insert herself into whatever was happening between an alpha king and his appointed beta. She had no standing to act, no authority to warn, no protection if her interference was received badly. And yet she had done it. Because 4 words were already pressing against the inside of her chest, insisting on being examined. He won't know until... Until what? Until it was finished. Until the Eastern Passage had been used, and whoever was waiting in position before dawn had done what they came to do. She was not a soldier. She was not a spy. She did not know the full shape of what she had overheard, only the edge of it, the outline, the way you can see the shape of something large moving beneath dark water without being able to name it. But she knew enough. She had known enough to write 4 words on a strip of linen hem and set it beside a king's hand. Your beta sold you out. They're in position. She pressed her fingers against her eyes in the dark and breathed. The question now was what came next. The answer arrived before dawn, not as a sound but as a presence. A knock on the servants' corridor door, 3 times, measured and unhurried. The kind of knock that doesn't need to be loud, because it already knows it will be answered. Molly was the only one awake to hear it. She rose without lighting a candle, wrapped her gray cloak over her linen dress, and opened the door. The sharp-faced man was standing in the corridor. Up close, he was younger than she had estimated in the hall, perhaps 30, with quick dark eyes, and that half-smile that she now recognized as a permanent feature, rather than a mood. He was still in his traveling clothes, which told her he also had not slept. "Molly," he said. Not a question. She nodded once. "My name is Rhett. I serve the king." He paused. "He wants to speak with you. Now. Now." She pulled the cloak tighter and followed him. The room she was brought to was not the Lord's chamber or the council hall. It was a map room. A smaller space off the main corridor of the upper floor, lined with shelves of rolled parchment, a long table at the center covered with territorial maps held flat at the corners by iron weights. 2 candles burned on the table. The copper-bearded man, whose name she would learn, was Cole, stood near the door with his arms crossed and his expression professionally neutral. Aidan Kyle was standing at the table. He was looking at one of the maps when she entered, a finger tracing a line that she was too far away to identify. He didn't look up immediately. He finished whatever thought he was following on the parchment, then straightened and turned. In the hall, with the distance and the torchlight and the noise, she had registered his presence the way you register weather, as something large and atmospheric that affects everything around it. In this small room, by candlelight, the effect was entirely different. He was simply a man. A very still, very watchful man, with pale eyes that had the particular quality of attention that made her feel, for one disorienting moment, that he had already read everything she had been thinking since she lay awake staring at the ceiling. "Sit," he said. There was only one chair near the table. She sat in it. He remained standing, which she noted was not a power gesture. He simply seemed like a man who thought better on his feet. "Tell me exactly what you heard," he said. "The words, not your interpretation of them. Words first." She told him. She repeated the fragment precisely as she had caught it, without addition or elaboration. Position before dawn, the Eastern Passage. He won't know until. She named the voices she had recognized. Cadence, and the other one, which she hadn't identified. A lower register, older. Someone seated 2 places from Caden at the high table. That would be Renwick, Rhett said from the corner without inflection. Vorn's head of border patrol. Aiden said nothing for a moment. His expression had not changed during her account. She had expected something. A reaction, a shift, even the careful blankness of someone concealing a reaction. She got none of those things. He simply absorbed the information the way the stone walls of the fortress absorbed cold, completely, without visible effect. "How long have you been at Vorn Fortress?" he said. 4 years. And before that, the village of Mir. I was sent here as part of a service agreement when I was 17. You can read and write. Yes, the village scribe taught me. That's uncommon for a servant from Mir. I know. Something shifted very slightly in his expression. Not a smile. More the suggestion of one, like a shadow of a thing rather than the thing itself. Why did you bring the note to me? He asked. You could have said nothing. What Caden Vorn does with his alliances is not your risk to carry. Molly looked at him steadily. Because you didn't know, she said, and someone in that hall needed to. That's a considerable risk for a woman in your position. Yes. You understood that when you wrote it. Yes. He held her gaze for a moment longer, and then he turned back to the map. She had the sense that the conversation had moved to a different phase, that the assessment part was finished, and he had arrived at a conclusion he wasn't going to announce aloud. Cole, he said. Sir. The Eastern Passage. I want 4 men there before the hour turns. Quiet placement, no torches. Already moving. Rhett. Already noted. Molly looked between them, understanding only then that the conversation in this room had not been the beginning of the king's response to her warning. It had been the middle of it. He had already set things in motion before she arrived. He had brought her here not because he needed the information confirmed, but because he wanted to look at the person who had sent it. She stood from the chair. You should return to your quarters, Aiden said, not looking up from the map. Stay in the servants' wing until morning. Don't use the Eastern Passage. I know better than to use the Eastern Passage tonight, she said. The half-smile appeared on Rhett's face again. Cole, near the door, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Aiden looked up. She was already moving toward the door, cloak pulled around her shoulders, because she had said what she came to say, and there was nothing else required of her here. She was a maid. He was a king. The transaction was complete. Molly. She stopped, turned. He was looking at her with those pale, measuring eyes, and for a moment the candlelight caught the angle of his face in a way that made the old scar along his jaw look like something deliberate, like a mark chosen rather than received. What Caden Vorn did tonight, he said. It was not a question, but it held the shape of one. She understood what he was asking. She had not mentioned it. She had told him only what was relevant to his safety, not the private embarrassment of a maid in a walnut-dyed dress who had been waiting along a side wall for a man who never looked her way. That's not why I sent the note, she said. I know, he said. That's why I'm asking. She stood in the doorway for 1 breath. 2, he made a promise he never intended to keep, she said finally. I was foolish enough to believe it. She paused. It won't happen again. She left before he could respond. In the corridor, walking back through the dark stone passages toward the servants' wing, she became aware of something she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't relief. It wasn't the satisfaction of having done the right thing, though she believed she had. It wasn't the residual sting of Caden's choosing, though that was still there, quiet and persistent, like a bruise you keep forgetting about until you press on it. It was something smaller, Something that had no weight yet, no shape she could trace, but that existed nonetheless. A thread of something unfamiliar, running along the underside of everything else. She wrapped her cloak tighter and kept walking. Behind her, in the map room, 2 candles burned on a table covered in territorial lines, and a man with pale eyes stood very still beside them, not looking at the map anymore. Dawn came gray and cold over Vorn Fortress. Molly heard it before she saw it, the particular stillness that precedes first light, the way sound changes quality in the hour before the world remembers to be loud again. She had not slept. She had lain on her side facing the wall, listening to Bryn breathe and to the distant muffled sounds of the fortress at night. Footsteps in corridors, the creak of heavy doors, once a sharp exchange of voices that cut off quickly and completely, the way voices do when someone decides the matter is resolved. She didn't know what had happened at the Eastern Passage. She knew only that the fortress was still standing, and that no alarm bell had been rung, which meant either that Cole's 4 men had been sufficient, or that whatever had been planned had been abandoned when the positions changed. Either way, the night had passed without fire or blood, and when the gray light finally began pressing through the narrow window above her bed, Molly rose, dressed, pinned her braid back with the leather cord, and went to work. Because that was the other thing 4 years had taught her. The world keeps requiring breakfast regardless of what happened the night before. The morning in the great hall was subdued. The long tables were being cleared of last night's remnants, overturned goblets, wax puddles, the bones of things eaten and forgotten. Molly worked the far end of the hall with a linen cloth and a wooden pail, stacking platters, wiping surfaces, moving quietly through the wreckage of harvest night, with the practiced efficiency of someone who has cleaned up after other people's celebrations, enough times to feel nothing about it. Bryn worked beside her and said nothing for a long while, which was its own form of communication. Then carefully, "Are you all right?" "Yes." "About last night?" "Caden." I said yes, Bryn. Bryn was quiet for another moment. Then, "He chose her because her father controls 3 border posts on the Ashvale line. Alpha Vorn arranged it. Everyone in the kitchen knew before the hall did." Molly stacked 2 more platters. "Then everyone in the kitchen knew more than I did. I didn't tell you because I didn't believe it was certain until—" Bryn stopped. "I'm sorry. I should have said something." "It wouldn't have changed anything. It would have meant you didn't spend 3 nights sewing that dress." Molly looked at her. Bryn's face was doing the specific thing it did when she was trying not to cry on behalf of someone else, which was one of the things Molly had always found both unbearable and deeply necessary about her. "The dress is fine," Molly said quietly. "I made it well. That part was mine regardless of what he did." Bryn nodded, pressed her lips together, went back to clearing. They worked in silence for a while, and the hall filled gradually with the sounds of a fortress resuming its shape after an event. Servants moving, fires being stoked, the distant percussion of the kitchen beginning the day's first preparations. Normal. Ordinary. The machinery of a place too large and too established to be meaningfully disrupted by the private griefs of anyone within it. It was into this ordinary machinery that the head housekeeper Sable arrived, moving with her characteristic sharp efficiency, and informed Molly that she was required in the upper corridor. "For what?" Molly said. "The king's men require the guest chambers attended. The king's own chamber is to remain untouched until specifically requested. The antechamber adjacent, that one is yours this morning." Sable paused, with the expression of someone delivering information she finds personally inconvenient. "You were specifically requested for the assignment." Molly kept her face neutral. "By whom?" Sable's expression tightened slightly. "By the king's man, the one with the red beard. Cole, then. Not Aiden himself." She told herself that distinction mattered, and then noted, with some irritation, that she had told herself that at all. She handed her linen cloth to Bryn and went upstairs. The antechamber was a narrow room with a high ceiling, a single window facing east, a writing table, 2 chairs, and a cold fireplace. Cole was not present when she arrived. Neither was Rhett. The room was empty, and after a moment of standing in the doorway confirming this, Molly went in and began building the fire, because the room was cold, and that was what the room required. She was placing the second log when the door to the inner chamber opened. She didn't turn immediately. She finished positioning the log, adjusted the iron grate, and then sat back on her heels and looked over her shoulder. Aiden Cale stood in the doorway between the chambers. He was not dressed for court. He wore a plain, dark tunic, unlaced slightly at the collar, leather bracers on his forearms, no ceremonial straps or iron buckles. His braids were slightly looser than they had been the night before, as if he had retied them himself in the early morning without particular attention to precision. He looked in this ordinary light like a man who had been awake all night attending to something difficult and had arrived at the other side of it intact, but not untouched. He looked at the fireplace she was building. "You don't have to do that," he said. "The room is cold," she said, and turned back to arrange the kindling. She heard him cross to the writing table and sit. There was the soft sound of parchment being unrolled, a map or a document, and for a minute, the only sounds in the room were the fire catching and the quiet movement of a man working at a desk. Then, it was Caden and Renwick both, and 2 men from outside the fortress, hired, not pack. They intended to intercept me in the passage before I reached my horse. A pause. Cole's men found them in position. No one was harmed. Molly fed a small piece of wood into the growing flame. "I'm glad. Caden is in custody. Renwick as well. Alpha Vorn is—" She heard something dry in his voice, cooperating fully with the inquiry as of approximately 1 hour ago. "Of course he is. You don't seem surprised." "I'm not." She heard him set something down on the table. "Why not?" She turned then, sitting back on her heels again, facing the room. He was watching her from the writing table with that same quality of attention, total, unhurried, the kind that made her feel simultaneously seen and measured, and that she was still not entirely sure how to receive. "Because Alpha Vorn smiled when Caden sat down next to the Ashvale woman last night," she said. "Not the way a father smiles when his son is happy. The way a man smiles when a piece has moved where he needed it. And Caden spent the rest of the night too relaxed for someone who had just betrayed his king. He was relaxed because he believed it was already decided." Aiden was quiet for a moment. "You observed all of that while standing at a side wall being publicly passed over." She met his eyes. "I'm very good at being invisible." "No," he said, with a certainty that was entirely unperformed. "You're very good at being underestimated. Those are different things." The fire caught fully behind her, filling the room with warmth and the smell of pine resin. She stood, smoothing her apron, returning herself to the dimensions of what she was supposed to be in this room. A maid, attending a chamber, performing a function. "Is there anything else the room needs?" she asked. "Sit down, Molly." She looked at the chair across the writing table from him. It was not the chair of a servant. It was the chair of someone who was expected to remain, to occupy space, to be present as a person rather than a function. She sat. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, and she had the impression that he was choosing words with some care, which struck her as notable in a man who seemed to waste nothing. "I'm going to need to remain at Vorn Fortress for several days while the inquiry is completed," he said. "I will also need to appoint a temporary liaison within the fortress. Someone who knows the building, the staff, the patterns of movement. Someone whose observations I can trust." Molly said nothing. "I'm not offering you a title," he continued, "or a permanent position. I'm asking for your help in the immediate term, in exchange for which you will be given different quarters, removed from Sable's assignment list, and compensated appropriately for your time. You're asking the maid, who handed you a note, to become your informant. I'm asking the woman who identified a conspiracy that 3 of my own trained men missed to assist me in the short term." She looked at her hands for a moment, then at him. "And after the inquiry," she said. "What happens to me then?" That, he said quietly, depends on what you want. It was, she realized, the first time in 4 years that anyone in a position to actually affect the direction of her life had asked her that question. What she wanted. Not what she was suited for. Not what she was assigned. Not what the agreement between the King of Myr and the Lord of Vorn required of her. What she wanted. She thought about the walnut-dyed dress, still folded at the foot of her mattress downstairs. She thought about 3 nights of candlelight and careful stitching, and the small, specific hope she had carried into harvest night. She thought about Caden's face turned entirely away from the side wall, and about the way it had felt to set down the wine jug and walk toward the archway, with her spine straight and her face still. She thought about a strip of linen hem and 4 words written in charcoal. "All right," she said. Something settled in his expression. Not relief. He had not been uncertain enough for relief. More like a recognition. The quiet acknowledgement of something confirmed. "Then we begin this morning," he said, and turned back to his map. Molly pulled her chair slightly closer to the table, folded her hands on its surface, and looked at the parchment spread between them. Territorial lines, border markers, the geography of a world she had spent 4 years navigating from the margins. It looked different, she thought, from this side of the table. The inquiry took 4 days. Molly spent those 4 days doing something she had never done in her life, occupying a room as though she had a right to be in it. The antechamber became a kind of working space. Maps on the table, documents cross-referenced, her own careful notes written in the small, precise handwriting the village scribe had taught her. She moved through the fortress differently during those days. Not with arrogance, not with the performance of status she didn't have, but with purpose, which turned out to be the thing that mattered most, because purpose changes the way a room receives you before you've said a single word. Rhett was the first of Aiden's men to fully warm to her, which surprised her not at all. He was the kind of man who appreciated competence the way other men appreciated beauty, immediately, openly, without complicated feelings about it. On the second morning, he had set a cup of tea on the table beside her notes and said, "You missed something in the Southern Corridor timeline, by the way. Renwick was unaccounted for between the 3rd and 5th bell. That's a wider window than you marked." She had looked at him. "I know. I marked it narrow deliberately to see if anyone would correct it." He had stared at her for a moment, then laughed. A real one, surprised out of him. "Right. Yes, Aiden's going to find you insufferable. He's going to find me useful," she said. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." Cole had said nothing to this, but the corner of his mouth had moved. Aiden himself was not an easy man to work beside. Not because he was unkind. He wasn't. He was precise, focused, and economical with both words and reaction, in a way that initially made her feel that every exchange was a test she hadn't been briefed on. But she came to understand, across those 4 days, that it wasn't a test. It was simply how he moved through the world, with his full attention, and without the social decorations most people use to make attention feel less intense. He asked her questions the way a man reads a map, directly, without pretense, interested in accuracy rather than comfort. She answered the same way. It turned out to be, without either of them apparently planning it, a functional language between them. On the 3rd evening, when the inquiry documents had been set aside and the candles had burned low, he had asked her about Myr, the village, her childhood, the service agreement that had delivered her to Vorn Fortress at 17. She had told him plainly, a small village, a practical arrangement, a girl who could read and write in a community that considered those skills useful for negotiating her placement. "Were you given a choice?" he asked. "No." "Would you have chosen differently?" She had considered that honestly. "I don't know. I was 17. I probably would have chosen whatever felt like the biggest life available to me. And now," she had looked at the map on the table between them. "Now I would choose the same thing, but for different reasons." He had looked at her for a moment in the low candlelight. Then he had returned to the document in his hand without comment. But something in the room had shifted slightly, the way rooms do when something true has been said in them. The formal conclusion of the inquiry was held in the Great Hall on the fourth morning. Every pack representative still present at the fortress was required to attend. The hall looked different in full daylight without the harvest night decorations. Starker, more functional, the stone walls and iron brackets stripped of their ceremonial warmth. The banners of the Alcadias still hung, but they seemed less like celebration and more like a ledger. Alpha Vorn stood before the hall looking like a man who had spent 4 days negotiating the precise geometry of his own culpability. How much to admit, what to deny, where the line was between ignorance and complicity. He had landed, Molly suspected, exactly where powerful men always landed, chastened enough to survive, intact enough to rebuild. Caden was not in the hall. He had been removed from the fortress on the second day, taken north under Cole's escort, to face formal judgment at the king's seat. His chosen woman, the dark-haired Ashvale daughter, had departed the morning after harvest night with her father's retinue, and no one had mentioned her since. The choosing had been quietly dissolved in the records as though it had never been ratified, which in the legal structure of the pack world, it effectively hadn't been, given the circumstances of the man who made it. Molly stood near the back of the hall, not along the side wall this time. She stood near the rear columns, in the section occupied by Aiden's men. Not because she belonged to his retinue officially, not because anyone had assigned her a position, but because Rhett had simply appeared at her shoulder that morning and said, "You're with us," and walked toward that section of the hall as though the matter was settled. She had followed, because it was. Aiden addressed the hall briefly. He was not a man who used ceremony when directness was available. He outlined what had been found, what had been confirmed, what the consequences would be. He spoke about the responsibility of a beta to his king, not with anger, which would have made it personal, but with the flat clarity of someone stating the terms of a world as they actually exist. Betrayal of this nature carried specific consequences. Those consequences would be applied. Then he said one more thing, which was not part of the formal inquiry proceedings, and which made Alpha Vorn's expression shift in a way that Molly found quietly satisfying. "The information that allowed this conspiracy to be intercepted," he said, in the same unhurried tone, came from a member of this fortress's staff. Her observation, her judgment, and her willingness to act were responsible for preventing harm to this crown, and to the stability of the southern packs. He paused. "Her name is Molly of Myr, and she will be leaving Vorn Fortress under royal acknowledgement." The hall was quiet. Sable, near the east wall, had an expression like someone who had bitten into something she hadn't expected. Bryn, 2 rows ahead, turned around and found Molly's eyes across the distance, and her face did the thing, the specific, uncontainable thing. And Molly pressed her lips together hard and looked at the ceiling for a moment, because she was absolutely not going to cry in the great hall of Vorn Fortress in front of every pack representative in the southern reaches. She didn't. She packed what she owned in less than an hour, because she had learned early not to accumulate things she would need to carry. The walnut-dyed dress she folded carefully and placed on top. It had been made well. It deserved to travel properly. Bryn came to help, and ended up mostly sitting on the edge of the bed, watching Molly pack, and asking questions she already knew the answers to. "Where are you going? What will you do? Will you write?" And Molly answered each one honestly, which meant some answers were "I don't know yet," and some were yes, always. "Are you frightened?" Bryn asked finally. Molly thought about it. "No. I think I've been frightened for a long time, and I've gotten used to calling it something else." Bryn stood and embraced her, the way she had embraced her the morning after harvest night, and the morning after that. The way she had embraced her every time the world required it. Solid and warm and unconditional. "You were always worth more than this place knew what to do with," Bryn said into her shoulder. "You always said that." "I was always right." Molly pulled back and looked at her. Bryn's eyes were red. Molly's were dry, which was something she would permit herself exactly until she was on the road and out of sight of the fortress walls. "Come visit me," Molly said. "Wherever I end up. Come." "Obviously," Bryn said, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "Someone has to keep you honest." The horses were ready in the outer courtyard when Molly came down with her bundle. Cole was overseeing the loading of the supply packs. Rhett was checking his saddle with the methodical attention of a man who has learned from experience not to trust other people's knotwork. Aiden was standing near the gate. He was looking at the road north, the direction they would travel, away from Vorn territory, away from the southern reaches, toward the King's Seat, which Molly had never seen and could not picture except as a place that was larger and colder and more complicated than anything she had navigated before. She stopped beside him. He looked at her briefly, that same quality of attention, complete and unhurried, and then back at the road. "You'll have proper quarters at the keep," he said. "A formal role will be determined once we arrive, based on where your skills are most needed. You'll be compensated, and your status within the household will be official." "I understand." "It won't be simple. The keep is—" He paused, with the slight compression of expression that she had come to recognize as his version of understatement. "Political." "I've spent 4 years being invisible in a political household," she said. "I suspect I'll manage." "You won't be invisible there," he said. He said it as a statement of fact, not a reassurance, not a promise, simply a reality he was informing her of, the way he informed her of all realities. She would not be invisible. Things would be seen. Her presence would register. She thought about that for a moment. "Good," she said. They rode out through the gates as the morning light broke fully over the eastern hills, turning the road ahead from gray to gold. Molly did not look back at the fortress. She had decided somewhere between packing her dress and walking down the back stairs for the last time, that looking back served no function she required. The road stretched north, long and open, and she rode it with her spine straight and her eyes forward. In the weeks that followed, the southern packs settled into the new order that the Inquiry had established. Alpha Vorn retained his title under reduced authority, a condition he accepted with the practiced grace of a man who understood that reduced authority was considerably better than the alternative. The Ashvale alliance was renegotiated through proper channels, without the involvement of anyone who had reason to want a king dead. Caden Vorn faced formal judgment at the King's Seat. The judgment was fair, as Aiden's judgments always were. Not lenient, not cruel, proportional in the specific way that carried genuine weight. Caden was stripped of his beta appointment and his claim to the Vorn succession, and assigned to a border garrison in the far north, where the winters were long and the political maneuvering was minimal. He served his time without incident. Whether he thought about the woman he had passed over on harvest night, no one could say. It was, in the end, not a question that mattered very much. At the King's Keep, Molly settled into her role with the same methodical competence she had brought to every task she had ever been assigned, except that now the tasks were different, and the room she occupied was one she had a genuine right to be in. Rhett remained, predictably, the most entertaining member of the King's inner circle. Cole remained the most reliable. The court was complicated and political, and occasionally exhausting, exactly as Aiden had warned her it would be. She navigated it well. She had always been good at reading rooms. Between Molly and Aiden, things moved the way true things move, slowly, without performance, with the patience of two people who had both learned that nothing real is built quickly. He continued to ask her questions with the directness of a man reading a map. She continued to answer with the accuracy of someone who had stopped being afraid of being seen. They sat at the same table, traveled the same roads, and over time the distance between working beside each other and choosing each other became so small, it ceased to be a distance at all. He asked her, one evening in the map room at the Keep, a larger room than the one at Vorn, with better candles, what she wanted. The same question he had asked in the antechamber, in the early days, except that now they both understood the full weight of it. She told him. He listened, the way he always listened, completely, without interruption. with those pale eyes and that quality of attention that had unnerved her at first, and now felt simply like being known. Then he told her what he wanted. It was the same thing. On the morning of their bonding ceremony, a quiet affair, witnessed by Cole, Rhett, and Bryn, who had traveled 3 days from Mere with a bundle of wildflowers and an expression of absolute vindication, Molly wore the walnut-dyed dress. Not because it was the finest thing she owned, which it was no longer, but because it was hers. Because she had made it herself by candlelight, and it had carried her through the worst night and into everything that followed. Aiden, when he saw it, said nothing. But his hand found hers, and he held it with the certainty of a man who had chosen once, consciously, with full knowledge of what he was choosing, and had no intention of choosing otherwise. Bryn cried. Rhett pretended not to. Cole simply nodded, as though the outcome had always been obvious to anyone paying attention. Outside, the road north was gold in the morning light, the same gold it had been on the day they rode away from Vorn Fortress, when everything was still uncertain, and the shape of what was coming had not yet resolved itself into something she could name. It had a name now. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was hers.